Hi friends, I'm glad you're back. I promised you a video on seeking feedback. Now that you have, by this point, hopefully, you are plugging away at your first draft, you have an official first draft, you've maybe done some revision and some self-editing, and you're feeling pretty good about where you're at. So you're probably asking yourself, like, shouldn't other people be looking at this thing? I shouldn't be the only person reading this book, right? Yes, that's very smart of you to think that, and that is correct. So today's video is going to talk about seeking feedback on your work and who you should be asking and what that looks like. Okay, so let's dive in. I want to first talk about the difference between feedback and criticism. And this is probably a lesson that you know, but it's very important to understand this so that you are prepared to ask for what you need. There are many stories of writers who throw their very raw and very rough, remember the phrase shitty first draft, SFD? They throw their draft out into the world, out to the pack of wolves, and it gets ripped to shreds and they never finish the book. I hear this once in a while, or I hear that they get stuck for a while and it takes them a long time to get back on the horse. I just worked with an author who this happened to. She wrote a first draft and got some feedback, and it wasn't what she needed to hear, and it was not positive in a forward-moving way, and it took her many years to get back to her book. So feedback and constructive criticism, first of all, is really what feedback is. Destructive criticism, on the other hand, is what we're going to try to avoid. It's just plain criticism. It's being critical for critical sake. The rule of thumb that I always use is that feedback needs to be specific. It needs to be positive in a way that moves the writing forward. Meaning, if you see something that isn't working, you have a discussion about what might work, a way that it can be improved, or why it's not working, so you can infer maybe there is a way to fix this. You don't just point out what's wrong. You also look for what's right. Hey, this is what you're doing well. That's something that I try to do with every single book, every single piece of writing that I get my hands on, because as a writer, you want to know what's working. Maybe you have a strength. Maybe you're really good at those descriptions, or you're really good at transitions or something, whatever. You want to know what you're good at so you can keep doing that thing. You can keep doing the good thing. Feedback or constructive criticism is thoughtful and compassionate and encouraging. It doesn't even need to be good feedback. It doesn't need to be positive in the way like, oh, I love your book, I love your writing. It can be pointing out something that needs work, but it still has to be compassionate and encouraging. Hey, this isn't working. That's okay. We're going to figure out a way forward. Or I have some thoughts for you. So getting good feedback can really make or break how you go forward with your book. It's basically about being seen and heard and supported and guided to do your best work. Now, it's really important to keep this in mind because you need to understand how you communicate your needs with the people from whom you seek feedback, okay? So we're going to talk about that next. But overall, whether or not you're getting some feedback that says your book needs work or it's doing all the things, you still should be getting feedback that is positive and supportive and forward moving. Now, you probably are thinking like, yes, Danielle, that sounds great, but how can I control what people will say to me? So that is where the next section of my lesson comes in. Let's talk about when you receive feedback on your draft. Now at this point, I'm positioning this video in my lessons to come at a place where you're probably done with your first draft. You've done some revisions, meaning you're looking at those big picture items and moving it around, and everything feels like it's where it belongs and there's not huge gaps. You've done some editing to the word choice and the way you've said things, and you're feeling pretty good about where you're at, but you know it's probably still rough. It needs some work. Or there might be a couple points where you're like, oh, I'm stuck on this one, and that's okay. I'm just going to keep moving forward. Maybe some places you feel like aren't totally working, but aren't stalling you in your progress. So there really is no right or wrong answer here, but I want to strongly discourage you from seeking feedback before you've done any revision to that crappy first draft. You want to just kind of vomit, get it out on the page. It's sort of a vulgar word, but just get it out, get it all out on the page, and then you want to mold it and play with it and move things around and improve it, okay? You don't need to read the thing 15 times before you send it off to someone to give you feedback. But I really don't want you to send it off for feedback when it's extremely raw and rough, unless you are dealing with a professional, like a coach. I know how to handle a manuscript like that. I've worked with many manuscripts that, in fact, I will never ever forget Brad, a client who hired me and said, by the way, I wrote this, I got really drunk one night and wrote this. And it was true. And it was an entire just like stream of conscious writing, and I had to dissect this entire book. He hired me as a ghostwriter, so I dissected this entire book, and we worked on this thing, and it completely shifted shapes. But I have worked on those rough and raw books. I know what to look for as far as what's missing or what's there. Most people that you will seek feedback from will have a different perspective on how to approach the project. So just keep that in mind. But you don't want to give them something so raw and so rough that they have a hard time seeing those big pieces. So remember, just get it all down. That's great. Then do some revision, even if you truly don't want to. But I want you to think about, like, where do I feel good about saying, yes, I want someone to look at this and focus in on some areas that I need some help with. So the answer to the question is do a little cleanup first and then go ahead and seek feedback. I want you to get your first draft done and at least do some revision. You don't necessarily have to do the line editing or phase 2 editing if you don't want to wait. But that is kind of the sequence of events that I want you to think about doing. So next, as far as how to move forward with seeking feedback, is who you should be asking. This is probably the most important point of my entire video today, whenever you're watching this. Irrelevant. Who should you be asking? And even more important, who you should not. In my head, there are two types of people that will give you feedback on your book. People you do not pay and people you do. I know that's a very business way of very impersonal way of looking at it, but it's very true. And this isn't a pitch for me to say you got to pay for feedback, but I want you to look at it from this lens, because people that you don't pay may be unpaid for a reason. Let's dive into that group really quickly, and look at who belongs in this group. First, your friends and your family. Think about spouse, partner, best friend, sister, mother. I want you to avoid, almost at all costs, just avoid anyone in your book, because they're going to have opinions about the way you remembered things. They may have some thoughts about how you presented a story, how you shaded them in a particular point in the book, a particular scene. They may not like it. That being said, there may be a person in your book who you just talk up and you're like, this person's amazing and I love them and they're the best person on earth. So they don't look bad in the book, but they may still have ideas and thoughts about, like, well, that's not really how I remember it. Those are not the types of comments that you're soliciting within this feedback round of your book work. You aren't looking to hear other people's opinions about whether or not your memory is serving you correctly. If indeed you want those opinions, you should be seeking them kind of in your pre-writing phase, like before the first draft is done and you've started doing some revisions. Maybe during the revision phase, the first draft can just be like, I don't care what it really looks like. I'm just getting it out of my head as I remember it. And then you might go back and have conversations. Hey, Mom, remember that time? Let's talk about this. I want to hear, what you have to say about it so I can see if that jives with my memory, and she can give you more richness and depth within that moment, within that scene, so you can incorporate that in your book. Perfectly fine to do, but not at this phase. This phase is going to require that you ask them specific things. We're going to get to that next. But my point is, anyone in your book, it may be distracted by the fact that they're in the book or that they have a different memory on that thing. They're not going to be able to give you the best of feedback because that will be something that might distract them. Now, you might be thinking, well, I have some friends who are writers. I have some friends who understand how to craft books and maybe aren't in my book. What about them? Let's talk about them. You probably have some friends who are writers and maybe they're very successful writers. But I want you to think about, when you think about friends and family, there's kind of a few questions you should use to qualify them. Number one, are they in your ideal readership? That's important because if you are writing a book on a very specific topic, for example, alcoholism, if your readers, if you intend your ideal readership to be people who are struggling with this same issue, and you ask someone who's never dealt with that to give you feedback on what is working in your book, they may struggle with the concept, or they may not understand why this is such a hard problem to solve. They may minimize it to some degree because they don't feel that pain and that struggle. So there may be a reason why you seek out readers, feedback givers that are in your ideal readership. Number two, do these people have any knowledge of the book writing process? Now that is where your writer friends might come into play. They might have some experience with writing books. They might be successful at it. Those people may be able to offer you more of an objective perspective from that point of view. They may be able to offer you some feedback on, hey, your tense shifted here, or the pacing is slowing down with this backstory. They're going to understand maybe some of those phrases and concepts. So if that's someone that you have in your close friends, you can consider them maybe a positive source of feedback, a positive feedback giver. One caveat is whether they know you very well. My experience has been, and I hear this from a lot of writers, that they get better feedback from someone who doesn't know their story very well, because when you know the story, you inherently fill gaps without realizing it. You are going to put those things together in your head before you even get to the next sentence. It's just what our brains do. Just like if you see a typo, you're not going to immediately drop the book and walk away and never pick it up again. You're just going to keep going. Your brain is going to fill that in. If it's missing a word or, a misspelling or something, that's just how our human brain works. So if someone is very familiar with your story, even if they're not in it, and even if they're very good at the book writing process, they're very skilled in that area or a very good writer, they still may be missing an edge that can provide you with some very valuable feedback because they're filling in the gaps without realizing it. So think about that as well. Next are maybe some friends or family or acquaintances that are familiar with the book publishing industry. So, you have a friend of a friend who's who works for an agent or something. That may be someone who can give you some positive feedback, but you also want to think about, well, what industry, what area of the industry are they most familiar with? If they deal with horror, fiction novels, what about your memoir might they be able to provide you some feedback on? They may not be writers. Maybe they haven't published books. They are in the industry and they're familiar with the industry, but it's not maybe specific enough. So think about that, whether that qualifies them as someone who could give you some better aligned feedback. And then lastly, are they familiar with the subject matter? For example, if your book is dealing with some type of mental illness, maybe anxiety, and you have a therapist friend who understands this, that might feel like it could be helpful to your book. You could really get some valuable feedback on, am I explaining this illness in a way that allows the readers to learn as they go about the struggles, and not only just from my perspective, but just in general in the medical community. So your therapist friend might be able to shed some light on that. However, again, take it back to the first qualifier. Will she or he be able to give you that feedback with your ideal readers in mind, or are they going to look at it from a very analytical, very academic standpoint? In other words, will they be able to help you or help make sure and give you that feedback that you're boiling these concepts down to the everyday person level that you're writing to, if assuming you are writing to kind of the everyday person? So those are the types of questions I want you to ask yourself before you get family and friends involved, especially those who are closest to you. I like to kind of think of a concentric target, right? You have the small little circle, the bigger circle, and then the bigger one. People who are in your close circle might be the least able to provide you with valuable feedback. They're going to really go against a few of those qualifying questions that I just proposed to you. But people maybe in the second circle might be better, and people in the third circle who you're familiar with, or who have the skills or the perspective that you're looking for in your ideal readership, those people may be able to help you better when we're talking about acquaintances or friends, coworkers, whoever, people you know. These are non-strangers. Now, I want to shift a little bit away from friends and family and talk about your writing group and your critique partners. Let's talk about how you seek feedback from these folks, because I'm guessing a fair amount of you could be in a writing group, or have been in a writing group, or have connections with other writers. Let's talk about what the upside and downside of asking them for their feedback is. Yes, they are familiar with the writing process. That's an upside. Someone who understands how to craft a book can give you that perspective of, hey, this flow isn't working and all of that. The structural stuff, the technical side of writing. They can give you that perspective on you're being clear here or you're not, and maybe look for those gaps. The only downside really is that critique partners and people in writing groups are technically still considered like struggling writers, for lack of a better term. They have not yet succeeded in getting their books done, right? What are they struggling with? Might they have similar struggles? That might be a bit of information you might not know, or maybe you do because you've talked about it in the group. So consider your audience. Who are you asking, and what are they also struggling with? And I shouldn't say also, but if they are struggling with something that you don't feel as confident with, that may not be a good match. One other really important key to think about with writing group partners or writing group members, critique partners, I know this is going to sound horrible, but no one likes to get bad reviews, bad feedback. And it's very easy to just focus on the positive and say like, oh yeah, I love your story. This is so great. Especially if you're not paid. So these people are going to try to give you those positives way more than they're going to try to find the negatives. And the negatives, they're going to glom onto things like, oh, you're using this cliche all wrong, and you're not showing and telling here, and I want more description, because those are the concepts that they're focusing in on in their writing. So I have very mixed feelings about writers groups. I think they're super supportive and really great resources to help you get your book out, but the feedback is very mixed in my opinion, and from what I hear about from other writers as well. They don't always provide that feedback that you really need to move your book forward. So just be cautious about that. So the next couple groups of people we're going to actually tackle more in depth in my upcoming videos, but they are who I consider to be in the paid group. I know you've been waiting to hear about beta readers, and I consider beta readers, you may not pay them always, and they may be, you could attach that term to a family member, a friend, or a writer, a critique partner, but beta readers should be treated with a different mindset of in this feedback request situation here. You're asking them something with the mindset of them kind of fulfilling a role. They're strangers to you typically. That's what the kind of typical beta reader definition is. But again, the broader definition is like anyone who reads your book and gives you feedback. But I want to talk about beta readers that you engage as kind of like an employment situation here. You might pay them or not, but you have an agreement for them to read your book and provide you with something. So whether or not that person is someone you already know, I still want you to kind of think about it in this light. And I do think that there is something to be said about offering them some compensation. So we're going to talk about that, because sometimes it is a tit for tat type of situation. If it's a writing group partner that feels like a good fit, you may offer to read their book and give them feedback. So there is something that I think should be very reciprocal about that relationship. So we're going to talk about that in the next video. And then we're also going to talk about professionals, people who do this for a living, why it's so valuable for you to look for the right type of feedback when you need it, and the right type of help and support when you need it, and from whom. Because, you know, when you're paying someone, you want to make sure you're getting what you need. But you also should be asking very specific questions from those people, from the people that you engage with, to ask feedback from. So whether or not this is an unpaid beta reader who falls more in the friend or family category, maybe a paid beta reader who's a stranger, or a professional, there are some things that we're going to talk about that come under that umbrella. So it's sort of like part 2. Don't hate me. This video is already 24 minutes long, so I want to make sure that you get the information about these other resources that I think are usually a better fit to provide you that valuable feedback that you really need in order to move your book forward. Otherwise, don't even bother. If you're not finding someone who's a good fit and you don't want to pay someone, that's fine. These aren't a requirement, but it can be a very rich resource of information to give you some clarity, validation, support, things that you need to fix that you never saw. Believe me, even in my own writing, I don't see things until people point them out. It's just human nature. So don't dismiss getting feedback, but you just want to be smart about it. Stay tuned for my next 2 videos when we're going to continue this conversation, because it is a very deep and long one, and I want to make sure I set you up for success on this. So I will see you in the next video, my dears.